Our relationship segment starts now. And today we're having a discussion on how will I coin this? Okay, how childhood traumas and dysfunction, how it affects relationships. We have Michelle Emwagware here, the founder of Insight to Wellness, joining us for a professional contribution. Now she is a certified family life and CBT practitioner. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so now some people don't understand what childhood trauma is and how it actually sort of equates to some form of dysfunction when it comes to relationships as adults. So can you give us a little breakdown into this angle?
Okay, so I'll just talk very quickly about what childhood trauma is. Typically, when people hear trauma, they think of big, events. So maybe rape, which could also cause trauma. Maybe escaping a fire incident or something, a robbery attack and all of that. So those things could cause trauma. But the trauma I'm talking about here is what happens as a child is growing up. So some people might refer to it as developmental trauma, where the child doesn't get his or her emotional needs met. And if you think of the way we raise our children, typically in Africa, it's almost as if every single child has some sort of trauma. What does a child need growing up? We need emotional connection. A lot of us as parents, because we didn't get it, we don't give it to our children. So our children grow up just like we did, without knowing what our needs are, first of all, and then even how to ask and receive it. And so if you grow up in a home, for instance, where there's a lot of violence, where you're constantly criticized, where you're constantly shamed compared to your siblings, and for a lot of African parents, it's like, this is how I want to, help you become a better person. If I don't criticize you, how will you know what to do? But what that does is it takes away your self-esteem. It takes away your feeling of safety. As simple as it sounds. So how that shows up later in relationships is when you're going into a relationship, because you're not grounded in yourself, you don't feel safe, you don't feel connected to people, you tend to go into a relationship looking for what was missing in your childhood. And so it shows up in many different ways. Either you become clingy or you might become the sort of person who is detached. So you want to connect, but it's also like you're afraid of it. So this is like in a nutshell how childhood trauma can affect relationships.
So I like the way you put it when you said connect, because there are a lot of children right now. I know we're talking about relationships, but there are a lot of young people right now that were told or taught to hold in emotion, meaning that eventually when they grew up, they didn't really know how to manage certain emotions, especially emotions like anger. So when children give temper tantrums, for instance, later on, so they're spanked, and that sort of pauses the tantrum. But in the end, they didn't manage that anger. So eventually they go into relationships and have anger issues. But then there's probably someone watching right now who has probably, just based on what we've said now, maybe is thinking back to some of the things that affected them when they were younger. How do they manage these traumas now? Because it's caused some sort of dysfunction. They might not know what it is, but it's caused something. Okay,
so you're asking how would they manage it if they find themselves in that situation? So awareness is the first thing, because once you know there's a problem and you're willing to work on it, then the solution, you pretty much found the solution. And so one thing I tell people, so I find that anger is an emotion that we typically tend to run away from because of the negative, connotations of anger. Yes, anger, if it's not well managed, can be destructive. But anger, like every other emotion, is a messenger. Your anger is trying to tell you something. So when you're angry, it's telling you that maybe you're being violated, your needs are not being met. So what I'll say to somebody like that is when you find yourself feeling angry, what you need to do is pause. Because anger is, that violent anger, it's a learned behavior. You probably learned it at home. Or, it's erupting because you're not allowed to process it when you were younger. But anger is a learned behavior, and you can unlearn it. So what I would say to such a person is, if you're finding yourself feeling angry, pause. Because now you're an adult. Pause. And then ask yourself, what is it, that I need right now? Sometimes we're angry because somebody said something that triggered something that our mother said or our father said. So even though the person, you're angry about what the person said, so to speak, But what you're really reacting to is what happened 30 years ago. And that's why people say things like, oh, why did you overreact? What did I say just now? Do you get? So you said something, I feel triggered, and I go back 30 years because it took me back to the shaming, to the criticism, and all of that. So what I would say is pause and ask yourself, what is it that what do I need right now? Are my needs being unmet? Are my boundaries being violated? Now, as an adult, you don't need to throw a tantrum. Just use your words, and just ask for what you need or set those boundaries. Yeah, so
now, the issue of dysfunction, that word, we need to sort of clarify how a family could be dysfunctional based on what's going on in childhood. Because we've been focusing on anger, for instance. But then there's another partner in this relationship who probably had a different growing up childhood years. So how can it be termed dysfunctional?
There are so many ways that dysfunction show up in the family. So, of course, when there's a lot of violence, that's what we know. A lot of people know that. So when there's abuse in the home, constant criticism. But there's another way that dysfunction might show up when you don't allow your child to be their authentic self.
Okay.
Because as human beings, the way we are made, we're created to be our authentic self. Okay. But a lot of us have had that, suppressed. So, for instance, you're growing up and you're a bubbly child. Maybe you're always knocking things over. You might be called clumsy, sit down there, you're making too much noise. And then over time, you start to hold back. You did say something about holding back. You start to hold back your authentic self. So now as an adult, it's almost like you're two people in one. You don't know if you're this person or the other person. Okay. So when you're not allowed to express yourself, to be yourself, that could be a level of dysfunction. Sometimes parents want their children to look a certain way because of how it makes them look in society. So suppressing the child's authentic self could also be a form of dysfunction.
I have to say a big thank you to you for coming to share this with us. And I know that there's still a lot to unpack with this topic. We're going to have you here with us throughout November. So we'll definitely be going further with conversations just like this. You might have some questions or contributions or angles that you're not clear about. Use our hashtag #WakeUpNigeria on TVC, and we'll see if we can answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.